Chairman Flake, Ranking Member Booker, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you very much for the invitation to testify today. I welcome this opportunity to share the State Department's assessment of the current situation in Zimbabwe, the state of our bilateral relationship, and the U.S. position on future engagement. Chairman Flake, let me first take a moment to thank you for your leadership of this subcommittee. We in the Bureau of African Affairs have been profoundly grateful for your commitment not only to our efforts in Zimbabwe, but also to State Department engagement across the continent of Africa. So thank you for that. On July 30th, Zimbabwe held its first presidential election without Robert Mugabe in nearly 4 decades. The election took place after a nearly 40-year history of deeply flawed elections, serious human rights challenges, catastrophic economic mismanagement, and widespread corruption. There were some encouraging signs in the pre-election period, including the welcoming of credible international observer groups and foreign journalists, and a more permissive campaign environment for members of the opposition. An election day itself was peaceful, but that is usually the case in Zimbabwe. Ultimately, however, the process was marred by the Army's use of deadly force against protesters on August 1st, and reports of supporters and state agents of the ruling party ZANU-PF assaulting and abducting members of the opposition in the weeks that followed. It is clear that Zimbabwe has a long way to go and requires profound political and economic reforms to sustainably change the path on which it has been for nearly 4 decades. Since taking power last year and since his election, President Mnangagwa has consistently stated his commitment to pursuing political and economic reforms, as well as a better relationship with us. We welcome the change in rhetoric from the Mugabe years. Since the election, we have seen some promising signs, including appointment of a new, more technocratic cabinet, announcement of an economic plan acknowledging the need for significant monetary and fiscal reform, and a budget which, if implemented, would make important strides in that direction. So far, however, the pace and scale of reforms has been too gradual and not nearly ambitious enough. A Zimbabwe that is more capable of providing for the needs of its own citizens and respecting human rights and fundamental freedoms will be a more responsible member of the international community. To reach that end, Zimbabwe will require implementation of fundamental reforms, not merely a commitment to do so. That is a message we have shared consistently with Zimbabwean interlocutors, including President Mnangagwa and senior members of his government. We want Zimbabwe to succeed, and we would welcome a better relationship, but the ball is squarely in the government's court to demonstrate it is irrevocably on a different trajectory. There are several steps the government of Zimbabwe could take that would send a strong signal to its own people and to the international community that it is serious about taking the country in a new, more positive direction. First, it should repeal laws such as the Public Order and Security Act and the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, which have long been used to suppress the human rights of people in Zimbabwe and which violate its 2013 Constitution. Second, the government should immediately end the harassment of members of the political opposition. It should drop charges against former finance minister and prominent opposition figure Tendai Biti and all those who have been arbitrarily detained for exercising their human rights and fundamental freedoms. Third, the government should hold perpetrators of the August 1st violence fully accountable. And fourth, the government should move quickly to ensure legislation is consistent with the 2013 Constitution, as well as uphold its letter and spirit. Those 4 actions will not by themselves transform Zimbabwe, but would constitute significant steps in the right direction. We will continue to consult closely with Congress on our approach towards Zimbabwe. The Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, recently updated by Congress, has provided a very important tool for us and clearly identified the reforms that we expect: restoration of the rule of law, a commitment to equitable, legal, and transparent land reform, and ensuring that military and national police forces are subordinate to the civilian government. In conclusion, the United States wants a stable, peaceful, democratic Zimbabwe that is genuinely accountable to its citizens and responsive to their needs. If there is real concrete progress along those lines, the government and people of Zimbabwe will find a committed partner in the United States. Thank you very much, and I welcome the committee's questions.
Thank you, Ambassador. Can you talk a little about ZANU-PF? Obviously, you have the opposition, the MDC, but within ZANU-PF, does Mnangagwa have free reign, or are there divisions within his own party?
ZANU-PF is deeply factionalized, I would say. One encouraging sign that we saw recently was the appointments of some new faces to the cabinet, technocratic members of the cabinet who have some experience in the private sector and in international development, and I think many of those are trying to do the right thing. At the same time, there are a lot of the old guard who remain in influential positions, and I think one of the challenges the reformers will face is that the political elites have held on to power through deeply entrenched patronage networks and will be threatened by some of the reforms that have been proposed, and will do everything they can to try to undermine those efforts.
President Mnangagwa took over about a year ago, but he's only been the elected president for about 4 months now. Is that sufficient time to carry forward or carry through on the reforms that need to be taken?
Senator, I guess I would answer that in two ways. One, it took Zimbabwe a long time to dig itself into this mess, and I think it will take some time to dig itself out of the hole, number one. But two, there are some things that some steps the government could take now to send the right message that it is trying to move Zimbabwe in a different direction. And these are steps that we have shared with the government. Number one, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, repeal of POSA and IEPA, two very repressive pieces of legislation, could be done now. It doesn't require support or assistance from the international community. Number two, a need to stop harassing members of the political opposition. You mentioned the charges against Tendai Biti. We think those should be dropped. There was an incident a couple of weeks ago of somebody being arrested in Bulawayo simply for criticizing the president. So that sort of stuff can be stopped now and would send the right message that things are changing. The Commission of Inquiry that was convened by the President to investigate the violence on August 1st has now completed its work and submitted its report to the President. It has not yet been made public. We would encourage the President to make the findings of that commission public, and if the recommendations are credible, to implement those recommendations. Ultimately, we are looking for those who are responsible for what happened on August 1st and in the aftermath to be held accountable. And the fourth step we would ask them to take is to begin to align a number of pieces of legislation with the 2013 Constitution. These are steps that they could take in the short term without a whole lot of assistance from the international community, and would send the right messages, I think.
Can you talk a little about the opposition, the MDC? There are factions within the MDC. Are they, Mr. Chamisa does not have a seat in Parliament. Tendai Biti does. What has been their response? Are they still holding protests or disputing the election results?
The MDC has long been factionalized, as you know. The biggest part of the MDC now is the MDC Alliance, led by Nelson Chamisa. The MDC Alliance and Mr. Chamisa himself have not moved beyond the election. I think they continue to challenge the legitimacy of the election. Mr. Chamisa led a protest last week in downtown Harare challenging those results. I think clearly the election was not a level playing field. There were major issues with the election. It was better than past Zimbabwean elections, but granted the bar is low in that respect. What we would like to see from the opposition, one, we encourage dialogue between the MDC Alliance and government. We think that's important. We would like to see the opposition play a role in defining what the important reforms are moving forward to move Zimbabwe in a different direction, and to play a role in determining how those will be implemented. And so we would encourage the opposition to engage in that kind of dialogue, and also begin to present an alternative vision for where it wants to lead the country, and build public support for that.
The U.S. representatives in the international finance institutions are prohibited from voting in favor of new loans to Zimbabwe under the rules that were put in place by the U.S. Congress until rule of law, transparent land reform, all these things that we've talked about. How far do you think the Zimbabwean government is right now from meeting these goals? What's a realistic timetable? Then what should the posture of the U.S. Congress be in the meantime? I
think, as I noted in my introductory remarks, I think the tone is different. The budget that was recently submitted in late November by the finance minister, who you mentioned in your remarks, contains some important steps that, if implemented, would begin to lead Zimbabwe in a good direction on the economic side. I think one of the things that we have stressed in our interactions at all levels of the Zimbabwean government, those meetings often start on their side with a statement, Zimbabwe is open for business, as you indicated, and that's fine, but we have reminded our interlocutors that the political reforms are just as important and inextricably linked to the economic reforms as well. So a lot of promises have been made, not a whole lot of action has been implemented, and I think the steps that I laid out, some of the steps they could take to send the right messages, could be done in a matter of months.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Well, Senator Coons has arrived. As I noted before, we've traveled a number of times to the region and into the country of Zimbabwe, memorably a few years ago, and we sat down for a very long dinner with Robert Mugabe that we really didn't ask for, but got nonetheless. And later, Chris led a memorable cocktail where we met with President Mnangagwa before the elections and heard some of the commitments that were being made at that time, some of which have been followed through on, some of which still need to make progress on. But I want to turn this over to Chris Coons.
Thank you, Senator Flake. Thank you for being tremendous chairman of the subcommittee and for the opportunity to travel with you and work with you. Zimbabwe, as I'm sure we all know, it was an important place that helped shape a young Jeff Flake, and he and I are just about the same age, and I spent a similar amount of time in Kenya and South Africa as he did in Zimbabwe and South Africa and Namibia, and to have the chance to work with you on these issues, to travel with you, has been a great blessing. That trip in February of 2016 that resulted in the unscheduled tea with Robert Mugabe, you know, someday should either of us write a book, I bet you that deserves a chapter right there. It was a fascinating insight into the dynamics at the time and the challenges that our ambassador faced and that our relationship faced. And when we got to return this past April to meet with a whole series of Zimbabwean leaders, it was a reminder just how much potential and promise there is in Zimbabwe, just how badly the people of Zimbabwe need reforms in the economy and in the governance. And we did indeed have encouraging conversations with President Mnangagwa and a wide range of civil society and economic leaders. We worked hard to pass ZEDERA, the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Amendment Act, together, updating the framework for U.S.-Zimbabwe relations. And 4 months after elections and after the passage of the ZEDERA Amendment Act, I'm looking forward to hearing more about where's our strategy, where are we going, and what is most likely to achieve the results we've worked so hard to see. And I look forward to our second panel of witnesses. Let me start, if I might, Mr. Ambassador, by just asking about the nature of China's engagement with Zimbabwe at this point and how it's changed since Mnangagwa assumed the presidency. China played a significant role in the liberation struggle, supported a lot of the efforts of groups that were fighting against the Rhodesian state, and so they've enjoyed a long and close relationship with Zimbabwe post-independence. But I'm concerned about rising indebtedness. I'm concerned about security cooperation, and would just be interested in your views on how China, which is active in virtually every country on the continent, is active in Zimbabwe and what direction that might take and whether there's any room for cooperation or partnership or whether there's inevitably some conflict in terms of our values in approaching Zimbabwe.
Thank you, Senator. And as you point out, this is a challenge we face across the continent. It is certainly a challenge that we face in Zimbabwe. The relationship goes way back to the liberation era. I think since President Mnangagwa's assumption of power after the departure of President Mugabe, he has visited, he's conducted a state visit to China. He is looking for investment from China as well. So that relationship is active. It's a major trade relationship. I think one challenge Zimbabwe will face going forward if we reach the point where we think about debt forgiveness or new lending, we're not anywhere close to that yet. I think we will have to deal with the fact that about a third of Zimbabwe's debt is owed to non-Paris Club creditors with the lack of transparency that comes with. So that will complicate the way forward economically should we reach that stage.
Well, so let's talk about that because ZEDERA prohibits U.S. support for multilateral and bilateral debt relief and credit for the government pending free and fair elections, adherence to the rule of law, other economic and political reforms. And we heard directly from the president and some of his senior leaders and close allies, a commitment to making progress in these areas, which I found very encouraging. I would like nothing more than to see the reforms in Zimbabwe that would support then our lifting all restraints and to see Zimbabwe back to being an open and healthy economy. Just review, forgive me my delay, I was actually speaking about Chairman Corker on the floor and his great leadership of the Foreign Relations Committee. To what extent has the government actually made progress on meeting the conditions laid out in the Zadera Amendments Act, and what do you see, what advice, if any, would you give, to the extent that's appropriate, to President Trump on supporting arrears clearance by certifying Zimbabwe's met any of these conditions or invoking the waiver that he has access to under Zadera?
As I noted earlier, there's been a change in tone. There's been a change in access. Our engagements with senior government officials, including President Mnangagwa, are much easier than they were during the Mugabe years, and that's a positive. We are hearing lots of commitments on the political and economic reform front. President Mnangagwa made a number of commitments in his inaugural speech and in his State of the Nation speech. And we've seen a positive budget introduced on November 22nd by the new finance minister, which identifies a number of steps on the economic side that, if implemented, would have an impact. We are seeing some positive changes on the tone and the rhetoric side. We're not seeing a whole lot of action. And I think we have a ways to go until we would be comfortable coming to the table and making the case for any kind of debt relief or new lending. I mentioned a bit earlier, we have avoided giving the government a long laundry list of steps we want to take. I've seen that not work very well in other countries. It gets bogged down in internal discussions about what ought to go on the list, and then the government does 50% and say they've done 100%. So the approach we've taken, in close coordination with like-minded international partners, is to say, here are some steps that you can take without much assistance from the international community that would send the right message that you're serious about reform. I mentioned repeal of two repressive pieces of legislation, dropping charges against Tendai Biti. We see those as spurious charges. Holding people accountable for the August 1st violence. We're waiting to see the results of the Commission of Inquiry. All of those steps, if they take them, they could take them in the near term, they could take them without a lot of cost, then I think that sends a message that we're serious, and then we can begin to talk about a different kind of engagement than we've had in the past.
And to what extent has there been any success in disentangling the finances of ZANU-PF from the state finances? And the question I'm really getting at is, if Zimbabwe were able to clear its arrears and get new loans from the IMF, from international institutions, what confidence do you have those loans would actually go to their intended purpose and would help accelerate the development of Zimbabwe and opportunities for its people?
At this point, not a great deal of confidence. Corruption has been a major problem in Zimbabwe. The president has indicated, among other political and economic reforms, a desire to focus on rooting out corruption. There have been steps taken to arrest or to file charges against some pretty prominent figures, but they all fall in the camp of President Mnangagwa's political opponents. We would like to see that effort broaden to include everyone who is suspected of corruption, regardless of political affiliation.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for your service in an exciting, challenging, difficult post, a great nation. One of the things that's always impressed me is the level of education and sophistication of Zimbabwe's people and political culture, and robust environment for political dialogue, and enormous potential. It is my hope that working together in the years ahead, we can really make a difference in advocacy. And thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for the chance to question. I look forward to our second panel.
Well, thank you. Just I might add how proud we are to have Ambassador Nichols there. He was thrown into it just a couple of weeks before the election. Real baptism by fire, but he's done a great job. I know that he keeps in regular touch with us to keep us informed about what's going on. That is appreciated. When I was there, I noted to President Mnangagwa that it would be the government of Zimbabwe would be well served to have regular contact with the ambassador before issues come up or as they come up, rather than afterwards. And I believe that that is happening, and that's a good thing. Tendai Biti has been raised a couple of times here. I can say, and I hope that you'll take back to the Zimbabwe government, if they're not listening in now to this, that it would be difficult to to move forward with any type of relationship with Zimbabwe and move forward on and progress on some of these issues, while charges are still leveled against him, and he is not allowed to travel freely. His passport has been revoked, I believe. He is a friend of this committee. He's been here a number of times, and I was pleased to see that you had that among your list of things that they could do. That would be a pretty visible outward sign that they're ready to move forward beyond the past.